I will now give the floor to the European Commissioner for Climate Action, Connie Hedegaard.
Thank you very much, Flemming Borgskov, Mr. EFC Chair, Mr. Ruding, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. What a pleasure it is to be here at this opening. I attend many conferences, but I think when I look through your program for the coming days, it's quite impressive. And I must confess that in a way I envy you just a bit. If I, as a politician, want to change things, and I do because that's why I'm a politician, then before I can move things, I have in my case to get first to persuade 700 and some members of the European Parliament, 27 ministers, soon 28. They have to get the backing of their governments, they had to get the backing of national parliaments and their cities. And on top of that, we have lobbyism like I do not know what. We need to listen to all sorts of stakeholders, many of whom advocating, please don't change anything because they have vested interest in business as usual. And whether I succeed or not, every tiny movement is closely followed. One could even say scrutinized, analyzed by press. And then look at you. The foundations, no difficult politicians, no press, or hardly no press, prying into what you're doing, and in return, you have loads of money. That's how I spell privilege. So I envy you, but I also need you. A world so badly in need for change needs your help. I'm not going here to tell you a lot about the challenges in the cities. You know a lot about that. But let me just put the challenge we are faced into that we are faced with into a very tiny personal perspective. My grandmother was born in 1901. At that time, the world had just passed the 1 billion people mark. My mother was born in 1936. That is actually the year where the world passed the 2 billion inhabitants. Myself, I'm from 1960. That was the year the world passed 3 billion people. My children, they will be living in a world where we are 9 billion people, share the resources of planet Earth. And at the same time, as if that was not spelling challenge enough, we also have a climate change challenge, which of course is related to the first one. I have a small movie I would like to show you. It should come here. This is not a forecast. It is the temperatures as they were registered around the planet since 1880. Where it is blue, it's getting colder. Where it's white, it's the same. And where the more yellow, the more orange, the more red it turns, the more the temperature is increasing. As you can see, still in the 1950s and 60s, it's a rather stable picture going up and going down. But then look now what is starting to happen. Not too bad in the 80s, but then. And it ends in 2012, the last year where we have a full year registered. This is not to tell you a lot about climate change, just to say, according to science, then this trend is going to continue. That is the kind of challenge we are in for. So at the same time, we have the challenge with the 9 billion people and climate change. We also have other crises right now, for instance, an economic crisis and a job crisis that absorbs most of the mental capacity of political leaders. Already now, 2 out of 3 Europeans live in cities. more will live there in the future. It goes without saying that our cities hold the key to a better future, hold the key to transformation. We know very well, everyone who wants to know at least, know that we are on an unsustainable path. Everybody knows that our growth model has to be rethought. Must be more sustainable, greener, cleaner, more resource efficient. It's not a question about growth or not, it's about which kind of growth. And I believe that everybody must realize that this grow first and clean up later, that cannot work, it's not responsible. China is a very good example, what then happens also to your economy, and nobody, for instance, in the Chinese leadership doubts how true this is these days. Yet, despite all this knowledge, big scale change, it's something of the most difficult to do in politics, and I would add maybe in particular in democratic societies. Just to give you a very simple example, we all value the freedom in having a private car, individual mobility, but it's now ending up in the collective immobility in our congested cities. We know it, we know where we are heading, nonetheless, we are just continuing full speed in this direction, even though it costs us around, for instance, in Europe, 1% of our GDP each year is the cost of congestion. So why is it so difficult to make change? I will mention a number of obstacles where I think you can be of help. The first one, Flemming Borsgaard already briefly mentioned it. We are faced with long-term challenges, but we are dominated by short-term thinking. The second is that we have cross-cutting challenges, societal challenges, but we are still living very much with systems dominated by silo thinking. Third obstacle is that we have an overload on our politicians and decision makers. Fourth obstacle is that we have this paradigm as if cheap is good, more is better, even when enough would be enough, but we have this quantity over quality, while at the same time what we really need is resource efficiency. And the fifth obstacle is communication awareness. You know that, talking about the first obstacle, short-term, long-term, city planning is long-term, buildings is long-term, infrastructure, energy, many of the things we are doing in our cities, that is something that reaches a far distance into the future. But the paradox here is that the markets that have to help us finance the solutions, make the investments, those markets often tend to be ridden by short-term thinking. Not because the market is evil, the market is very much necessary, but because that is the nature of the market. That's also why you have politicians whose job is to think for the longer term, but also there, the tendency very much, not the least in a time of crisis, is to think short term. There, I believe that you as foundations are extremely interesting and can make a necessary difference. Everybody these days are very much in need for capital, investors, capital that can and will think for the longer term and for the common good, patient money. Because change takes time. We need investors that are dedicated over time. Also, investors where profitability is a broader notion than just the money that an investment can cast off in the very short term. Some will have to invest in the first development. Some will have to come forward with the new ideas that then can be scaled up and replicated. I think that that's also where your foundations have an enormous convening power and an independence also to go into the partnerships that was also mentioned by Flemming. To leverage, that is something you can really do. Use your money to leverage investments. The second challenge, the cross-cutting, seeing the silos. Having been now in politics for many years, I must say that one thing is that politicians tend to be sort of organized in portfolios, but it's even more so with administrations. They have their sort of portfolios, this is what they do. It also goes to a certain degree for business. It definitely also goes for the university and the science community. I think that what the foundations can do is you can convene business, civil society organizations, science, and politicians. And you have the overview. To have that overview, to have this holistic approach, that requires resources. And I'm not just talking money-wise, but also to engage, to find the solutions cross-cutting, and to, when you have found these solutions, to disseminate them, to take the lessons learned and get it out there. I think it's one thing that is very challenging when we are talking about changing cities or whatever, but in this case cities, that often there is this tendency in the classical economics, as it's being conducted in finance ministries, that we look at an investment and that spells cost. We're not very good at looking also at the co-benefits. And again, that would require a much more cross-cutting thinking. Take, for instance, if you address in a city climate change and air quality, noise problems, the well-being in the city, the green areas and health, and start to think it together, then it's a very different economic calculation of whatever investment you want to do. Philanthropy can do this. The third barrier I mentioned, the overloaded decision makers. I think they need we need some nudging. And I think that need will be bigger and bigger. Take in Europe. All over Europe in the next years, there will be an extremely strong focus on more efficient welfare systems, more efficient and reformed public sectors, and there will be a tendency, of course, that they will focus on their core tasks. That is economically necessary. It's what the taxpayers and the citizens would expect. But the danger, of course, would be that it will not necessarily promote visionary thinking, or this culture will not risking anything, no failures. There would probably be a tendency to go safe, to stay with proven practices. Here you have the power to put up demands and requirements that politicians often do not dare put in front of investors in the fear that then they will move to the neighboring municipality. I think also there you can help with some creative thinking. And the fourth barrier, quantity versus quality. I really do believe we need a paradigm shift. We need to move to resource efficiency, energy efficiency, recycling, a very different way of defining our growth, as I mentioned. The politicians there, of course, be it locally, regionally, or nationally, or internationally, they have their defined jobs. They must put up the targets, the incentives, get the pricing right, regulations, planning tools can be used much more systematic, and so on and so forth. That is all needed as useful drivers. But there is no guarantee against, for instance, ugliness. And there, this paradigm, the cheaper, the better. That is, of course, quite a challenge. I'm also a taxpayer, so I know why this is tempting. But I can also sometimes see that had we had just a slightly more refined way of deciding things, we might also have some more beautiful surroundings. Normally, politicians shy away from that dimension for many good reasons. But there you, through your money, through your knowledge, and through your examples, have a possibility to influence, and of course also a responsibility. I think that there you could exploit even more, that when your foundations are in on a project, it's sort of often a quality stamp in itself. The last point I would mention is communication. Anna was mentioning I have a past as a journalist, and in journalism we say, don't tell it, show it. An alternative future is hard to visualize through the key tools of politicians, being words and laws. People tend to believe that tomorrow is probably almost as today. But in the 21st century, business as usual will not be business as usual because of climate change, because of the resource crisis, because of the need to create the growth for all these people. So we need somebody to show the positive vision, to translate the values into real, tangible solutions. And there you have a potential, because if one like you and your foundations often are being perceived as being above interest, what a trademark, above interest, you can get away with a lot. And you can get a kind of positive attention that politicians seldom get. Well, yes, if they participate in dance shows, but then they cannot sort of also talk about their visions. Everybody else has their agendas. In politics, do-gooders are almost negative, as if they must be a bit naive. But it's really, really fine in case of foundations. Actually, what you would expect from philanthropists isn't that exactly to do good. I know that you're discussing whether it's worthwhile to stick your neck out, and also by that risking having some attention and some press. I can only say from my perspective, please do. We really need to have your contributions to the transformative times we are living through. As I mentioned, politicians must put up targets, frameworks, incentives, also for the longer term. They must also have a vision, obviously. But in order to get the mandate from the citizens to do so, there must be a profound awareness out there among the citizens. And there must also be the good examples, the good ideas, the convincing ideas, the attractive and creative visions that show that there are other ways, new ways, smarter and more intelligent and sustainable ways to build our future society. Not just theoretically, but showing it in practical, real life. When I look at the potential, the resources that you represent here today and your foundations represent, and I'm not just talking about the economics, but then I must say, wow, if we really work together, we can still have time to move things where we need to move them. Thank you very much and have a very good conference.